Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Boudros, Policy Director for the National Coalition on Healthcare, and I will be hosting the event today. NCHC is a nonpartisan and multi-stakeholder coalition of healthcare and consumer voices dedicated to affordability and access. We are excited to have all of you here today. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. First, we will not be accepting live questions, but please email contact us at nchc.org to submit a question. This email address will be available at the end of the presentation as well. Secondly, a recording and materials will be posted on nchc.org/events as soon as possible after the event. And we will also be sending the recording and materials to the registrants. And lastly, I would like to thank our speakers, which are shown here on the slide. Thank you for giving us your time and expertise today on this critical issue before the Congress. As you can see, we have a robust agenda for today's program, so I will get us kicked off. First, I will turn it over to Sean Martin, Interim CEO of NCHC and Executive Vice President and CEO of the American Academy of Family Physicians. He will introduce NCHC's perspective on drug pricing and introduce our first speaker. Thank you for joining us, Sean.
Michael, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this important discussion on prescription drug pricing. Again, welcome, and thank you for joining the National Coalition on Healthcare. We are proud to co-host this event with West Health, and I'm looking forward to today's program. The NCHC, as Michael said, is a nonpartisan multi-stakeholder coalition representing business, unions, healthcare professionals, insurers, consumers, patients, and many more. The coalition's mission is to bring together key stakeholders to achieve an affordable, high-value healthcare system. I want to start with some principles that guide NCHC's perspective on drug pricing. First, pharmaceutical products and drugs are indeed a component of a high-value healthcare system. Physicians, including primary care physicians and other healthcare professionals, prescribe medications often to their patients as a valuable part of their care. However, all Americans, future and present, deserve true innovation from the industry and affordable prescription medications. We know there is both a small portion of high-cost drugs with excessive launch prices and decades-old life-saving drugs with high year-over-year price increases, neither of which are well justified. Further, manufacturers distort markets through lookalikes, evergreening, and anti-competitive behavior like patient thickets. These various practices are not affordable to patients and not sustainable to our healthcare system. Something needs to change. The costs of inactions are now too great, both for consumers and our healthcare system. Family physicians in particular are at the forefront of care decisions with their patients every day and see the ongoing burden of high drug costs and the conflict that can present for patients. There is an imbalance in the system and it's not working well for all patients and for their families. We heard during our last briefing with West Health how high drug prices, coverage gaps, and other system issues drive health inequalities and significantly harm communities of color. Today, we will explore what needs to be done in Congress for all Americans and whether high prices are justified by claims that research and development would suffer. At this point, I am going to turn it back over to Michael to introduce our first speaker from West Health. And again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to your comments and engagement. Michael.
Thank you, Sean. So we will change our agenda slightly. I'm going to now introduce Amy Herr, who is a Director of Health Policy for West Health Policy Center. Amy is an expert in state and federal health policy analysis focusing on seniors. Amy's career has focused on enabling successful aging and lowering healthcare costs. Thank you for partnering with us today, West Health, and thank you for joining us, in particular, Amy. And I will now turn it over to you to walk us through public opinions on drug pricing.
Great, thank you, Michael. Next slide. Hi, everyone. My name is Amy Herr. I'm Director of Health Policy at the West Health Policy Center. West Health is a family of organizations focused on reducing the cost of healthcare to enable successful aging. And we do that by combining medical research, advocacy, policy analysis, and an outcomes-based philanthropy. Okay, next slide. Today, I'm going to show two sets of polling with you. that we've conducted at West Health. The first is with the Gallup organization, which we partnered with since 2019 to show the impact of high healthcare costs on the American people. And secondly, with the Global Strategy Group for some political polling in some key states. So first of all, I wanted to share that the status quo is just not acceptable. There are millions of Americans that can't afford their treatments or their drugs, or they're missing, skipping pills. They just can't afford to get the treatment that we have available. So that's not great. And it's costing not just dollars, but also costing lives. And we found through one of our polls with Gallup that 34 million people know someone who's died in the last 5 years after not being able to afford the cost of their care. So that's unacceptable. Okay, next slide. So it's not a surprise that based on the high impact of high healthcare costs, that Americans are ready for government action. We found in multiple polls, I won't read all of these, but there's just strong support across party lines for government action, more involvement in drug pricing, and ensuring that prescription drugs are available to people. Okay, next slide. This is some great polling that we just released in June of 2021. We found that 90% of Americans believe that drug pricing needs major reform. And this held true across party lines. And it was just very significant that it was such a high number. Okay, next slide. As part of our political polling, we also asked about prescription drug reform when compared to other areas of priority among the American voters. So we asked about climate change and infrastructure, and across the board in all of these states, we found that prescription drug reform is the #1 top issue for voters. And also not just as a pay for the other activities, but on its own as a top priority. Okay, next slide. So the most important for this briefing today is that we asked the American public how they felt about innovation. And we found that most Americans do not believe negotiation will hurt innovation. In fact, only a small percentage of Americans felt that way, and this held true across party lines. So even here, 97% of Democrats agree, 80% of independents, and almost 2/3 of Republicans also agree that negotiation will not hurt innovation. Okay, next slide, great. And finally, we just wanted to show here that most Americans support Medicare negotiating drug prices for all Americans, not just for people in the Medicare program. So we want to make sure that any changes that happen will affect people in the commercial market as well as people in the Medicare program. And we found in some other study that we've done that negotiating drug prices in the commercial market could save employers about $200 billion and employees another $60 billion. And to conclude, I just wanted to say that, you know, Americans really support drug pricing reform, and it's a matter of life and death. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So now we have, we're hoping that Congressman Peter Welch is now available to speak. We are interrupting his busy day of votes. So thank you, Congressman Welch, for joining us. I will skip my introduction and let you just take it away.
Well, you know, thank you very much. You know, I was listening to the wonderful polling report, and if this has, as Amy explained, broad bipartisan support. And the reason it does is the biggest challenge we have in our healthcare system in this country is how much it costs. Our country has great healthcare if you can get it, but the prices keep going up way faster than inflation. And we pay the most, our country, of any country, and our outcomes are not the best. They're mediocre. And that's a fact. It's not an argument. Now, we've got to get the cost of healthcare under control. The biggest driver of healthcare costs right now is the escalation in prescription drug prices. And as may have been mentioned by others, we pay in this country at least on average 2.5 times what the same drug costs in another country. And many times it's 7 times what a drug is paid for in another country. And interestingly enough, and this goes to the bipartisan support for this, Donald Trump was a very big advocate for international reference pricing, basically said have our price be similar to what is charged for the same prescription in Great Britain or in France or in Germany. And that makes sense. Why should we pay that much more? Now, pharma always has an argument, and they say it's because we do research. But let's unpack that a little bit. Pharma does some research, but a lot of the pharmaceutical drugs are not the product of research by the company that owns it. They're the product of research of the company they bought. Many drugs are created and then purchased by a big pharma company, and they pay billions of dollars for it. And then the day after they purchase that drug, they quadruple the price of that medication, and then you and I and our healthcare system pays the cost of that acquisition. But the other thing is that the evidence shows that pharma, by and large, pays more for advertising than it does for research and development. And of course, just recently in the tax cut of the Trump administration, that was a $2.1 trillion tax cut. Billions and billions of dollars went to the pharma industry, and they did not use that money to do more research. They did it to do stock buybacks. So it helped the share price a lot. Now, as much as I'm for real aggressive efforts on the part of the government to bring down the cost of prescription drugs, I'm one who acknowledges that what pharma does with the creation, distribution, manufacture of medications can be life extending and it can be pain relieving. And that's a good thing, but they're killing us with the price. And we could have a fair price if our country played the role that every other government does on behalf of its consumers. And that is stand up against excessive pricing power, in many cases price gouging, by the pharmaceutical industry. We're the only country where we don't have price negotiation. And think about the absurdity of that. If you're buying 100 aspirin, you're going to get a cheaper price per pill than if you're buying 10. And of course, the Medicare program is the biggest purchaser of prescription drugs. And by law, it's prohibited from negotiating with the pharma industry about what the price it is that we'll pay. Now, some folks say that if you have price negotiation, it's going to be the government setting the price. That's not true. And let me give an immediate example. We had a partnership when it came to creating the vaccine for COVID. The federal government put an immense amount of money into advanced production. It guaranteed that it would purchase the prescription. So you had a guaranteed market. You had taxpayer money put into actually manufacturing facilities where it was done on speculation and hope that there'd be a prescription that could be manufactured and then distributed to the American people. And there was a negotiated price. And it's like $19.50 per dose. Now, this was a partnership. You took the extraordinary organizational capacity of a major company like Pfizer, the research of Moderna. We came out with a vaccine. We had a negotiated price, and it worked. And there was a partnership because it's not in the interest of the government to have such a punitive price that the citizens that the government represents doesn't get the benefit of that medication. On the other hand, it's very much in the interest to get a fair price. And the pharma company, in this case Pfizer, did good work, and it's doing extremely well with the negotiated price in that partnership. The other thing that pharma is always talking about intrusion by the government. And again, every other government protects its citizens. But the pharmaceutical industry enjoys extraordinary governmental benefits. First of all, it gets intellectual property protection. And I'm for that, but they abuse it by extending a patent from 10 to 20 to 30 years by doing just little modifications that they are able to game the system with so that they continue to have that monopoly pricing power. Number two, they have a guaranteed purchaser. The Medicare and Medicaid programs have to buy these prescriptions. So the pharmaceutical industry, when it makes a prescription, it's not like it has to do what other companies that make a product have to do. They have these guaranteed programs financed by the taxpayers, Medicare and Medicaid. And of course, our private employers, for whom it's a really big deal to provide good healthcare coverage for their workers, they really have to buy them as well. So you've got governmental protection on the exclusive period of the patent, where there's enormous, actually exclusive pricing power by pharma. You've got the guaranteed purchaser of Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance employers. So those are two huge things that are extremely beneficial. And then the third thing, of course, is there is immense billions of dollars of taxpayer-funded research that is done that has been responsible for the breakthrough discoveries that have led to medications that then get commercialized and sold. That's all taxpayer research, taxpayer-funded research. And the benefit then gets appropriated by the pharma companies. So what you see now is a situation where when just recently, there's this Alzheimer's drug that got very controversial approval from FDA, which is being whittled back. The price that the pharmaceutical company put on a single year dose of that, a year supply, is $55,000. There's 6 million eligible people with Alzheimer's, unfortunately, who are in the Medicare program. If just a third of those individuals got that prescription at that price, the cost of the Medicare Part B program would be $110 billion. $110 billion. And think about that. That is more money on one drug than the entire Medicare Part B program pays for all drugs for all its millions of participants. That's not sustainable. It just isn't sustainable. So there is enormous agony and anxiety among all people. Whether you voted for Trump or you voted for Biden, it really doesn't matter. If you've got someone you love who's got a serious illness and needs a medication, and that price is so beyond your ability to get it, what good does it do you? And that's where I think it's not just bipartisan. It's where there's an opportunity, if we do things that are absolutely reasonable and other countries do to protect their citizens against abusive pricing practices, then it's beneficial for all of us. It's beneficial for our employers who are often wanting to give a raise to their workers, but they get hit with a 20% premium increase, and there goes the raise. It goes into maintaining status quo on healthcare. It's good for our families if they just aren't terrified about what the out-of-pocket is, or whether there's a prescription that can be helpful to someone they love, but it really means their family's going to be bankrupted. So I appreciate the work that you all are doing. It's really important that we stay the course on this. And, you know, it's time, it's time for pharma, which does do good things, to stop abusing the pricing power and privileges it gets through the taxpayers, through the legal system, and through congressional legislation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Congressman Welch. We really appreciate your remarks today, as well as your ongoing leadership on the issues related to healthcare affordability and prescription drug access. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Good luck. Have a good meeting.
Thank you. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Fred Ledley. MD, who is the director of the Center for Integration of Science and Industry at Bentley University. His group focuses on advancing the translation of scientific discoveries for public value by promoting synergies between science, business, and policy. And Dr. Ledley is going to tell us about some soon-to-be published research related to the association of changes in pharmaceutical revenues and changes in research and development spending. Take it away, Dr. Ledley.
So thank you very much, Amy. It's what a great honor to follow Congressman Welch and his comments about the problem of drug pricing and the proposed solution. The work I want to describe today, which was funded by the West Health and West Health Policy Center, is really looking at the question which has been raised by critics of these policies as to whether reducing drug prices will necessarily reduce innovation. And if I could have the first slide, please. Let me talk a little bit about give you context of my background. I am a physician by training. I trained in pediatrics at the Boston Children's Hospital and was on a faculty of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute and the Baylor College of Medicine in Houston for a decade, where we studied the genetics and also cures for pediatric diseases. Work that my laboratory did and work from some of my colleagues, most of which was funded by the NIH or by the Howard Hughes Institute, led the school to form a company which I joined at its inception because that company could do things towards actually bringing a drug to market that we could not do in academia. I spent a decade in industry, ended up being the founder of 3 companies in roles ranging from chief scientist to the president and CEO, and came away with a deep respect for the industry and its capabilities, but also understanding that that only works if there's synergies between the needs of medicine, the advance of science, and the business practices of that company. And what we do now on the faculty at Bentley University and our Center for Integration of Science and Industry is explore how to enhance those synergies to generate as much public value as possible from the fruits of scientific discovery. So when you ask whether reducing drug prices will slow innovation, the question is logical to people. Anyone who's balanced a checkbook knows if it's going to be out of balance, you reduce your spending. And there is some evidence that suggests this is something to be concerned about. There was older research that looked at when the Clintons proposed healthcare reform in the 1990s, suggesting industry did respond to that proposed policy change by cutting research. Conversely, there's evidence that when Medicare Part D was approved in the early 2000s and the markets for pharmaceutical products were increased by making these drugs more available, that in fact pharmaceutical R&D spending increased. And of course, the CBO in the last several months ran a model in which they suggested the numbers of new drugs could drop by as much as 30 products over a decade. Our analysis suggests a different outcome. And the data I'll show you today suggests that any negative impact of reducing drug prices may in fact be mitigated by normal practices of the pharmaceutical industry. And this conclusion is going to be based on 2 things. One is that small pharmaceutical companies have an increasingly important role in new drug development. Congressman Welch talked about this, that many of the drugs, much of the heavy lifting of development is being done by small companies, and I'll show you some data. And those companies are subsequently marketed and sold, and the revenues accrue to large companies. And also, the industry has made enormous progress towards what's called agile management. Won't go through it, but I teach it in my management courses, which allow companies to very strategically allocate resources to maximize those resources for product development. So next slide, please. Let me pitch right into it. this is what the data looks like. This data was actually generated by one of our undergraduate students several years ago. If you simply ask, do companies with more revenue spend more on R&D? And the answer is, of course, yes. If you have more resources, you have more resources to spend. And this is what it looks like if you look at almost 1,400 companies over a 20-year period. And I'll tell you, while this looks like a nice curve, in fact, it's likely the wrong answer. And it probably proves nothing except the big companies are really big. They have more resources, they have more activities. Next slide. What that data misses is that the very small companies, and I'm talking here, you might be able to see a little red blotch at the bottom left of that slide. Those companies are responsible for 40% of all drug approvals, 40%. And the data for that comes from IQVIA, published several months ago. It's on the left, and this is a change. The number of drugs coming from these small companies has almost doubled over the past 5 years, and they now account for at least 40% of new drug approvals. Next slide. And if you look really closely at that little red dot, in fact, there's no relationship between how much revenue they have and how much R&D, how much they spend on R&D. So this was the first clue that looking at the whole industry, which is what most observers have done previously. Most previous work looks at only the largest companies or looks at sort of very general statistics. But we're going to drill down now on these two groups of companies. Next slide. And if we separate companies into large companies, which have a market cap of about $7 billion, that's roughly equivalent to being included in the S&P 500. These are big companies. And you then put everyone else in a group of small companies. You have about 78 big companies. Now they are responsible for 70 to 80% of drug sales and revenues. And you have about 1,300 companies in the small category. Next slide. And you see that these companies are very different. The big companies, we're looking at about $11 trillion in revenues over the past 20 years. Of that, they are investing about 1.7 trillion in R&D, and they have profits also in the 1.8 trillion range. And essentially, and most of those profits, about $1.6 trillion of it, are being siphoned out of the companies as something else that Congressman Welch mentioned, being delivered, that cash is being distributed to their shareholders. The smaller companies are different. They're losing money. They lost a total of $262 billion, and they're raising a lot of that money from Wall Street, from investors, either venture private investors or public investors. If you look at the graph, what you see here is we're looking at what fraction of the R&D, or what fraction of their revenues are they spending on R&D. And if a company's revenues are proportional to their R&D spending, it will give you a line, a horizontal line here, which is what you see in black. And black is the large companies, okay? The small companies, which are in purple, are all over the place, right? They are sometimes spending 10 or 100 times more on R&D than they're getting revenues. Sometimes it's less. There's no relationship at all between R&D spending and revenues for these 1,300 small companies. Next slide. And if we drill down on the big companies even further, here we've divided them into 4 groups. The very largest are the magenta here, then the blue and the green. We see that for the very biggest of the big companies, you have the most likelihood that they will adjust their R&D spending to match their revenues. Next slide. And we can put numbers on this. Slide has a lot going on, but basically the slope of the lines you see tells us how much revenues may impact R&D spending, such that a 1% change in revenue for the very largest companies in the 2 quartiles For every percentage change in revenue, we also expect a 1% change in R&D. For the next smaller group, we expect a little bit less than a 1% change in R&D spending, and even less change for the smaller. And for the small companies, we expect no change in revenue from, we expect changes in revenue will not at all impact their R&D spending. And again, this is historical data we're looking at. We're looking here at industry practice over the past 20 years. Next slide. Now, the small companies, we mentioned that the smallest of the small companies are responsible for 40% of drug approvals. We asked how many of the clinical trials are being performed by our small companies. And what we found is these smaller companies, where we do not expect them to cut R&D, are currently doing 60% of all the clinical trials. The larger companies are very engaged in clinical research, but it's proportionately less. Okay, next slide, please. So we could put all this in a model. I'm not going to go through the nitty-gritty of modeling here, but let me just point out the assumptions of our model. The model is going to ask how many drugs will come out of the pipeline if we see the types of changes in R&D spending that we know are in the record. So that means no change in spending by the small companies, and for the large companies, reductions that are proportional to changes in revenue. So we're modeling a 10% reduction in revenue, which is roughly in the low 20s in terms of reducing drug prices, in the ballpark of HR3. We're using published values for what industry says it costs to develop a drug, how much you spend for every clinical trial. We're using industry data for phase transition, success rates, and we're adding to this the proportions that we observed of how many trials are performed by large versus small companies, and how much will they reduce their spending. And the model allows us to test different scenarios and to ask how many drugs are approved now at a steady state. Next slide. Let me point out what is and is not in this model. This is based on industry best practices, and particularly what I mentioned earlier, agile management, the ability to reallocate resources. We are not assuming in this model that there are new advances in how to do research or development, new ways to do clinical trials, or new regulatory paths. We're not assuming any increases in research efficiency, and we're not assuming any changes in corporate practice or even their policies or their priorities. Okay, next slide. So focus on the bottom of the slide. This is what the model looks like. In the baseline case, which is what happens today, if you put 400 drugs into development, you will come out with 47 approved products. That's the track record. There's a very high attrition rate of drugs, as most of you know, related to the need to show safety and efficacy. But there's also a high attrition rate for what's called commercial failures. And that is, some drugs fail because companies simply stop their development, or the company decides to reallocate their money to other projects or work in different therapeutic areas. And that commercial failure rate is estimated to be in the 20 to 30% range. We looked at three scenarios, right? The scenarios are a 10% reduction in revenues, where large companies reduce their R&D spending proportionally. Small companies, it's business as usual. And if you simply cut your costs across the board during clinical development, and we're only assuming cost reductions in clinical development, you would only get 45 drugs out. If you actually take an extremely naive approach and you take all your cost reductions in late stage trials, you would only get 43 drugs out. And these are not the strategies we assume industry would use. We assume industry will try to maximize their output. They will allocate resources to the best of their ability between the phases. And when you do that in this model, we see no change in the number of drugs approved at the end of the day. Slightly paradoxical result, but it comes from what I mentioned, the ability to decrease the number of commercial failures by more strategically allocating your R&D costs. So next slide. So look, putting all this together, we think that industry has the ability to strategically allocate any cost reductions that are necessitated by HR 3 to mitigate negative impacts of the policy. We tested 3 scenarios. One gives us no change whatsoever. So what we're saying is we think industry best practices are sufficiently robust to provide patients both with relief with high drug prices and the innovation that they need for new therapies in the future, and that policy does not need to make a false choice between these two endpoints. Prices can be reduced. Negotiating prices to get what can only be called a reasonable price makes a lot of sense. And the innovation that we all depend upon for continuing to treat diseases like Alzheimer's should be able to continue as it is now. So that's our conclusions. Next slide. I want to thank the West Health Policy Center and Sean Dixon for supporting this work. Also the members of our team who have done the heavy lifting, Roger Dew, who worked with us as an undergraduate, Drs. Franklin Bright, Sarah McCoy, Kevin Zhang, and Juliana Harrison, as well as our 2 executives in residence whose critiques are very important. They bring a lot of industry experience to our work. So thank you very much. Last slide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ledley. We appreciate it. Next, I'd like to introduce Sean Greminger, Director of Health Policy for the Purchaser Business Group on Health. At PBGH, Sean leads efforts to improve quality and affordability for consumers and healthcare purchasers through federal policy.
Thank you very much, Amy, and delighted to speak to this group today. Really appreciated the comments by Dr. Ledley and, of course, Congressman Welch. I think they fit in well with the just a couple thoughts that I want to add coming to this debate from the perspective of businesses, healthcare purchasers, employers, and then I'll finish talking a little bit about our alignment with the consumer world. I guess the most important thing that I think, the thing that I want to convey is businesses ultimately prefer to purchase goods and services in a free and open market. We operate in free and open markets in general. We think that competition works. We think that transparency of cost and quality allows us, and just as any other consumer, to be able to make a value equation. Try to decide what is whether a business decision is worth the value. And I'll give you just an example of the auto business, right? This is a highly competitive market. And if I, as a consumer, choose to purchase a Mercedes-Benz because I don't mind paying twice as much as the cost of a Honda, I'm able to know a couple of things. I'm able to know the difference in price, and I'm able to at least generally assess the difference in quality and say, yeah, that's worth that trade-off for me. And I have options. I have the ability to buy a very expensive car. I have the ability to buy a relatively inexpensive car. I have the ability to buy different cars within different sectors. I can get a truck, I can get an SUV, etc. The drug space doesn't work anything like that. Our friends in the pharmaceutical industry would like to tell you that they are, promoting competition, that they want to have free and open markets, but in fact, the entire way that we pay for drug development in the United States is through government-sponsored monopolies. I think that's the biggest challenge that we have, is you have a business or a business sector that wants to be treated both as a monopoly and not be treated like a utility. Normally, when you have a government-sponsored monopoly, like an electric utility or a water utility, there's very tight controls on what the price of the service is going to be, because there's a recognition that within a monopoly, there's no way to have reasonable competition, to have an open market. I have very little to add to the excellent work by Dr. Ledley in terms of the impact of legislation on prescription drugs on research and development and whether you'll see more drugs come to the market. They've done excellent work. The only thing I would add, just again from the perspective of folks who are major employers and businesses across the country, is that it's hardly the pharmaceutical industry that's the only place that engages in research and development, right? Lockheed Martin spends $1.5 to $2 billion a year in R&D, and yet they don't ask to be able to sell their drugs in a monopoly. Actually, the business sector that spends the most in research and development is the tech sector, which is also a very highly competitive market. There's a realization that R&D is built into the price of the Apple iPhone that you have or the Samsung smartphone, but ultimately they still are able to compete and offer different services at a relatively reasonable price. So what you see again is the pharmaceutical sector trying to be out there on an island by themselves, saying, we need to be treated special because we have special considerations, when it's just simply not the case. As I said, I think our real goal is to be able to purchase value. We want to be able to know the overall effectiveness of the drug that we're purchasing on behalf of our employees, and we want to be able to pay a reasonable price for that. And I'm going to give you the example of two drugs, and actually Congressman Welch talked about one of them. So I think most people on the line will remember Sovaldi, which came out several years ago. Very expensive drug. Last I checked, $168,000, or maybe it's $108,000, for a course of treatment to treat hepatitis C. By no means a great deal, but the thing about Sovaldi is that it is truly a wonder drug, right? It's actually curative for many people with hepatitis C, and for others, it makes a huge difference in their life. And you take it once, right? I'm going to compare that to Aduhelm. This is the Alzheimer's drug that the congressman referenced. Aduhelm was approved by the FDA despite the fact that there is very limited evidence that it even works. And to the extent that it works, its efficacy in actually combating Alzheimer's is extremely limited. And yet, despite that, because of the messed up system that we have, Aduhelm is trying to sell the drug at $55,000 a year. Again, it would be a maintenance drug. So unlike Sovaldi, which you take once and may cure you of hepatitis C, if you get on Aduhelm because you have Alzheimer's, you may very well be taking that drug for the rest of your life, year over year over year, bankrupting the federal government. If Aduhelm was effective, if it actually cured Alzheimer's, I think we could have a reasonable conversation about what that does for the healthcare system and how we should price that. But unfortunately, we don't have any sort of mechanism to be able to do that here in the United States. We simply say, yep, you developed a drug, it's safe, it's maybe reasonably a little bit effective, and now you get to decide whatever price you want, and Medicare has no ability to negotiate on the price of that drug. That's a system that makes absolutely no sense. I want to conclude by noting that employers and purchasers are really actually very well aligned with consumer advocates in the consumer world and the labor unions as well. PBGH led a letter of 40 organizations along with Families USA and AFL-CIO and AFSCME. We had employers, purchasers, labor, and consumer groups on the letter, focused on the need to act swiftly and act boldly this year. In the end, the people who are purchasing the drugs on behalf of their employees and the employees themselves have the same goals in mind. They want to be able to have access to high quality prescription drugs that are effective, but at a price that people can actually afford. Our letter is pretty straightforward. It provides lots of good flowery language that I helped to write in terms of why this is important, but ultimately asks for three things. It says that a successful prescription drug package this year needs to allow Medicare to negotiate the price of drugs as described by Congressman Welch, that those negotiated prices have to apply to the commercial sector, and I'll talk about that for a second in a minute. It says that we need to make sure that we cap prices for drugs that are currently on the market. This has been a major problem where you see drugs that have been on the market for many years, have not seen, the R&D costs have been well paid off, and pharmaceutical makers decide that, you know, this is the year to go ahead and increase the price of that drug by 20 or 30% because they think that they can profit maximize, despite the fact that there's really no good reason why they should have to increase the price of the drug. So we recommend capping the price increases for drugs currently on the market to the rate of inflation. And then finally, it recommends that prescription drug package restructure the Part D program in Medicare to reduce both out-of-pocket costs, but also reduce overall costs of the healthcare system. Not surprisingly, those three asks are consistent with what is included in H.R. 3, which is the legislation that passed the House of Representatives in the previous Congress and is likely to come back up. And we think it's consistent with the principles outlined by Chairman Ron Wyden on the Finance Committee when he outlined where he wants to go with his bill. I want to just finish with one last thing. Issue of particular importance to employers and purchasers, but hopefully of importance to anyone, including, I'm guessing, the vast majority of the people on this call who buy their drugs through their employer-sponsored insurance. The previous version of H.R. 3 did not provide protection to private plans when it relates to the inflation caps. It basically said that Medicare would cap the rate of growth in inflation, but private plans would have to sort of fend for themselves. We've worked very closely with House leaders and Senate leaders and have reached an agreement that says that all of the provisions in the legislation will apply to private plans as well. We think that's critical. We're very worried about what could happen if you have Medicare having a inflation cap and not applying to private plans. So we're pleased that that's going in the right direction, and we're confident it's going to be in, hopefully, final legislation that's moving through Congress, I'm guessing, after the August recess. So with that, I will pause and turn it over to our next speaker.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for representing the organizations on the letter and for your remarks. Clearly, the purchaser and consumer communities, their perspective is essential to our efforts today, and we appreciate your comments. I think you highlighted all of the comprehensive points that I would have made. I especially enjoyed highlighting that competition and negotiation is not new for the federal government. It's not a far field idea for the pharmaceutical industry to do the same. So I need to change the agenda slightly. Unfortunately, Alyssa Slotkin, Congresswoman from Michigan, is unable to join us today due to votes on the floor. But I would like to first point people in the direction of the letter that her and a number of members signed to House leadership urging that the next reconciliation bill include Medicare negotiation as part of providing relief to American families who feel forced to make a choice between their medications and putting food on the table. So I point you to that letter for her thoughts on this issue, but I won't speak for the Congresswoman. But we appreciate all of the speakers who were able to join us today, and especially would like to extend our thanks to Congressman Welch for joining us during a busy legislative day. And thank you to all of our speakers, including Dr. Ledley, who was able to provide quite a comprehensive rundown of the evidence behind industry claims that price controls or Medicare negotiation, or however you would call it, would disrupt innovation. We know, as Sean Martin brought up at the very beginning of this presentation of this program, that the National Coalition on Healthcare believes that pharmaceuticals are a key, valuable part of the healthcare system, but there are practices that the Congress should take attention to so that Americans can afford the medications. So with that, we're going to end the event slightly early, and we appreciate all of you attending today. And again, in terms of housekeeping, if you have any questions, please submit them to contact us at nchc.org, which is on the screen now. We are happy to forward your questions to whoever is the most likely to answer. And we are happy to send you the materials, the recording, after this event. So thank you very much to everyone who joined us today, including our speakers, and please enjoy your summer. Thank you.